Can you hear me okay? Yeah. It's a great pleasure for me to be back in Japan again, to be able to see again my Japanese relatives by marriage, to be again with my many Japanese friends and colleagues and students. And I will add that just 5 minutes ago happened to me a wonderful thing that could happen only in Japan. On the bullet train here from Tokyo to Kyoto, I forgot on my seat a personal, valuable electronic device, a small device, and I just learned that the device was found by the Japanese train company and is being held for me and will be sent back to me. That would never happen in the United States. That's something that happens in Japan, and it's one of the many wonderful things that I enjoy and admire about Japan. Today, I'd like to tell you about the development of my interest in geography and in the environment and in writing about science for a broad public. I was born in Boston on the east coast of the United States in the year 1937. Being born in 1937 meant that I grew up during World War II. And that meant that as a child, I lived with geography constantly in my face. On the wall of my bedroom next to my bed, my father pinned up 2 maps, a map of the European War Theater and a map of the Pacific War Theater. Every day, Dad moved the pins to show the shifts of the battle lines in Europe and in the Pacific. One of my earliest childhood memories at the age of 5 was of the first photograph that the American Army released of dead American soldiers, 2 American soldiers dead face down, lying in the surf on the beach at Buna, New Guinea, a shock for all Americans. When I was 7 years old, we discovered and opened the Nazi concentration camps, and the world and I were shocked to see photographs of bulldozers pushing piles of starving, dead prisoners into big trenches, pushed by bulldozers because there were too many bodies to be buried individually. That childhood helped form my worldview of what geography does to people. As a result of that childhood, I grew up thinking that I could never marry a woman who had not also grown up in World War II and shared my memories, because such a woman could not understand a big formative part of my life. In fact, my Polish-American wife, Marie, was born in 1948, after the end of the war, but the war was an even more vivid experience for my wife, Marie, than it was for me, because Marie's mother survived Auschwitz concentration camp. Her father survived a Russian prisoner of war camp. And so for Marie, the war was an even more vivid secondhand experience than it was for me. My 4 years spent living in Europe as a graduate student in the 1950s and 1960s reinforced my understanding of how geography molds our human lives. My European friends, like me, were born around the year 1937, but their lives had been very different from mine. Their lives had been scarred firsthand by the war. All of my European friends had either been orphaned or had lost brothers and sisters or had watched their parents' house being bombed or had lost opportunities for education. None of those things had happened to me, not because I had more skill, but just because of the geographic accident that I had been born in the United States, whereas my friends born the same year as me had been variously born in Britain or Germany or Finland or Yugoslavia or Russia or Japan. And so that reinforced my understanding of how accidents of the place or year of one's birth are important, as I was to rediscover when I began working in New Guinea. Of course, the effect of geography on our wartime experiences is extreme, but geography also has a big effect on our lives in peacetime, because, as you know well in Japan, there are rich and poor countries, and the wealth of a country depends upon whether the country is an island and what countries are the neighbors of your country, and of your country's access to the sea, and of whether your country lies in the temperate zones with fertile soil and few diseases, or in the tropics with infertile soils and many diseases. You know those things very well in Japan. My father was a physician. My mother was a teacher, a linguist, and a concert pianist. Both of my parents were first or second generation immigrants from Eastern Europe into the United States. I learned different things from my two parents. From my father, I acquired my interest in science. My mother taught me to read when I was 3 years old. My mother taught me writing style when I entered school by every week correcting my compositions, teaching me English grammar and punctuation every week until I was 16 years old. Also from my mother came my love of learning languages, of which I started learning what will be my last language, my 13th language, at the age of 61. My mother also started me on piano lessons at the age of 6. Later I studied the viola, the big violin-like instrument. I studied organ, and I considered developing a second career as a professional musician. But I recognized that I lacked the talent to be a professional musician, but I've remained an amateur musician, and I get a lot of pleasure by playing piano in chamber music groups. My musical training has been of advantage to me in studying New Guinea birds because I'm particularly good at identifying New Guinea birds by their songs, which I learned to describe in the terms that I use for listening to music. Finally, I have only one sibling, a younger sister, to whom I was constantly explaining things when we were children. And growing up explaining things to a younger sister may have contributed to my love now to being an author and trying to explain things to a broad public. After attending Harvard College, I pursued a PhD in laboratory physiology at the University of Cambridge in England by studying salt and water transport in a small organ called the gallbladder inside of us buried in the liver. The gallbladder is not an important organ, but its physiological transport mechanisms prove to be similar to the transport mechanisms of much more important organs, such as the kidney and intestine, whose complex anatomy makes them more difficult to study than the gallbladder. Now, the essence of laboratory science is to do manipulative experiments by creating and then comparing different conditions, for example, in two test tubes. That's to say, by creating comparisons. For example, by putting a gallbladder in a solution containing potassium or not containing potassium. Comparisons also became my preferred method for studying bird ecology and human history, as I'll tell you. I became one of the world's leading experts on gallbladder physiology, a distinction for which I had very few competitors. There are not many gallbladder physiologists in the world, maybe 4 or 5. I obtained a professorship at the University of California, Los Angeles Medical School with the responsibility of teaching medical students and continuing to do experiments on the gallbladder. But it gradually dawned on me with growing horror that the career course expected of me was to devote the rest of my life to the gallbladder. Such a life felt limiting. Fortunately, in 1963, a college classmate of mine who shared my love of bird watching proposed an adventurous summer of mountain climbing in the Andes Mountains of Peru. At the end of that summer, in the mountains, we sought more adventure by going down to the tropical rainforests of the Amazon basin, where we had the good luck to be let off by a river steamer at the mouth of a small river on which lived a recently discovered tribe of Indians with whom we spent a week. There was nothing for us to do in that village of Indians except to talk with the Indians and to watch birds. We loved it. We published 2 papers on our bird observations. Those were my first scientific papers on birds. Could we now see the slides that I'm going to show you? Now, as background to my talk, without talking about them individually, I'm going to show you the wonderful photographs taken by my colleague, David Bishop, a photographer as well as an ornithologist. Pictures of New Guinea people and New Guinea scenery and New Guinea birds, and you'll understand why I love this place. In the next summer after our visit to Peru, my college friend and I sought more adventure, extreme rainforest adventures, on the tropical island of New Guinea. At that time, New Guinea ranked as the wildest and least known part of the world, with several million tribespeople who had only recently been discovered by the outside world and were still using stone tools and were chronically at war with each other. That appealed to our thirst for adventure. New Guinea is an ideal field for a bird watcher and for a geographer for several reasons. New Guinea is home to the world's most remarkable birds, the birds of paradise, of which you'll see 2 pictures later. New Guinea's high mountains go up to 5,000 meters, but New Guinea lies on the equator. So that New Guinea is one of only 3 locations around the world where there is snow on the equator at the tops of the mountains. The other 2 being the mountains of the Andes and Mount Kilimanjaro and Mount Kenya in East Africa. As you ascend a mountain in New Guinea, you go up through virtually the entire range of the world's habitats, but all within a distance of just a few kilometers. At sea level, you start from the coral reefs and the tropical rainforests. You climb up through the oak forests, and then the beech forests, and then the coniferous forests, as in Japan, and then the subalpine grassland, finally to reach the snow at the tops of the mountains. If you wanted to find that range of habitats at sea level, you couldn't traverse them in a few kilometers as you can in New Guinea. You would have to walk 11,000 kilometers from the equator to the poles. But as a gallbladder physiologist, I now had to devise different methods to study New Guinea's birds. It's possible, and it's considered morally acceptable, to add potassium to solutions bathing gallbladders. But it's difficult, and it's considered immoral, and it's illegal to manipulate bird populations experimentally. And so instead of carrying out the manipulative experiments of laboratory science, I came to rely on natural experiments for my bird studies. Natural experiments meaning that instead of creating comparisons as in the laboratory, I learned to look for natural comparisons. That is, if I wanted to study the effect of a bird called the mountain mouse babbler on another related bird called the lowland mouse babbler, I didn't do a manipulation of locally exterminating mountain mouse babblers. That's not nice and it's illegal. Instead, I compared mountains on which mountain mouse babblers naturally were either present on some mountains or absent on other mountains. That's a natural experiment. And that's also the technique that I used when I began to study human history seriously. From 1964 onwards, I've been returning to New Guinea every year and a half to study birds. Initially, my New Guinea bird studies were pure science, studies of bird evolution, ecology, and behavior, always sprinkled with adventure. The discovery for which I'm best known among bird scientists, ornithologists, was my rediscovery of New Guinea's long-lost mystery bird, the golden-fronted bowerbird, that had previously been known only from 4 specimens that turned up somehow in a Paris hat shop in 1895, but nobody knew where they came from. I rediscovered that bird at the top of New Guinea's remote and uninhabited Foya Mountains, into which I had been dropped by helicopter. Soon, though, I found myself increasingly concerned that the New Guinea birds and forests that I loved were under threat from destructive human activities, just as are plants and animals elsewhere in the world. And so I contributed to founding an emerging science of conservation biology by using bird distributions on islands around New Guinea as models for devising optimal national parks, which are virtual islands of natural forest surrounded by an ocean, virtual ocean, of human-altered habitat. My largest scale opportunity to apply island biogeography to national park design has been in Indonesian New Guinea, where I began working in 1979. When I arrived in Indonesian New Guinea, by chance, the Indonesian government had just decided on land use allocation in Indonesian New Guinea, assigning some areas to forestry projects, other areas to mining, and other areas to national parks. And so the Indonesian government gave me $1,000 and told me, come back after, explore New Guinea, come back after a month and give us a plan for national parks. Naturally, $1,000 in 1 month is absurdly little to explore New Guinea, but previous information about New Guinea biogeography and understanding of general biogeographic principles let me flesh out the database. I produced a plan. I've spent the last 40 years exploring the national parks that I proposed, and I've seen much of my plan adopted as the national park system for Indonesian New Guinea. At least as important to me as what New Guinea birds have taught me about biogeography, ecology, and evolution is what New Guinea people have taught me about human societies and about how to conduct my own life. New Guinea, whereas Japan has 1 people and 1 language, New Guinea has 1,000 different tribes and 1,000 different languages, each different from the other, but all of them sharing differences from the modern industrial societies of Japan and the United States. Universal human issues like friendship and bringing up children and having a meaningful old age, those issues are solved differently in New Guinea from how they're solved in Japan and the United States. And I've learned from New Guineans about how to rear my own children, how to confront growing older, and so on. But the most fundamental and puzzling feature of traditional New Guinea societies was their less advanced technological development compared to modern industrial societies. Traditional New Guineans had no metal tools. Instead, they had stone tools. They had no writing. They had no kings. They had no chiefs. And so New Guineans used to be regarded as primitive people. Was that because New Guineans are less intelligent than Japanese and Americans, as racists and colonial administrators assumed? When I arrived in New Guinea in 1964, it took me only a day or two to realize that New Guineans appear on the average to be at least as intelligent, curious, and quick to learn as are Americans. Why then were these smart New Guineans the ones who ended up with the stone tools, whereas I, who came to New Guinea representing the culture with metal tools and writing, whereas I, in New Guinea, am a stupid person who cannot find my way in the jungle or light a fire in the rain without help from a New Guinean. Eventually, in 1972, a New Guinean named Yali with whom I was chatting, asked me the question directly, the central question of New Guinea experience. Why did Europeans arrive in New Guinea bringing cargo? Cargo is the New Guinea word for material possessions, advanced technology, when New Guineans had little cargo of their own. As I'll explain, it took me 25 years to find an answer to that seemingly simple but basic question. Around 1980, my scientific interest began to shift. I began publishing articles about big questions of history and geography in popular science magazines, trying to explain those questions not only to myself and to my sister, but to the broad public around the world. There were two events in my life that accelerated my career shift. The first event was a phone call that arrived for me out of the blue, unexpectedly, just like the phone call from the Asahi Glass Foundation informing me of the award of the Blue Planet Prize. That 1985 phone call, unexpectedly, came from the MacArthur Foundation, a foundation in the United States, informing me that I had won a MacArthur Fellowship, which meant 5 years of support and money to do whatever I want with no requirements. My initial reaction, of course, was delighted. You too would be delighted at being given lots of money every year for 5 years. But my subsequent reaction was to get depressed. It's the only week-long depression I've had in my adult life. Why? You would expect a phone call announcing lots of money for 5 years to be exciting. Yes, it was, but it was paradoxically depressing because the phone call seemed to be saying, Jared, you haven't been living up to your potential. We at the MacArthur Foundation expect you to do more important things than to study gallbladders. You're already 40 years old. When are you going to start to do something important for the world? That was the first event triggering my career shift. Here's a bird of paradise. The other event triggering my career shift was the birth of Marie's and my twin sons, Max and Joshua, in the year 1987. I had already been writing articles about world problems, about what the state of the world is likely to be like in the year 2050. But for me, the year 2050, because I was born in 1937, I'm not going to be alive in 2050. 2050 is an imaginary year, like the year 2837 to me. But when my twin sons were born in 1987, they are very likely to be alive in 2050. They'll be only 63 years old then. They'll be approaching the peak of their lives. Their lives then will not depend upon my discoveries about gallbladders. What could I do to help create a better world for my sons? Well, the MacArthur Foundation Award and the birth of my sons made me decide to try to live up to my potential and to influence the future world of my sons by writing books for a broad international public. I began the first of these books, The Third Chimpanzee, shortly after the birth of my sons. That book, The Third Chimpanzee, examines how apparently uniquely human features, apparently absent from animals, like human language and human art, could have evolved from animal precursors. Human art and language and other distinctively human characteristics must have evolved from animal precursors because we humans, here's another bird of paradise, we humans and chimpanzees were the same evolutionary line until the human line and the chimpanzee line separated only 5 million years ago. So art and language must have evolved gradually from those ape ancestors. That was the subject of my book, The Third Chimpanzee, and I still look back on it as my most enjoyable and best written book. My next book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, published in 1997, has proved to be my most influential book. It finally addressed the question that had been on my mind ever since my first visit to New Guinea in 1964, and especially ever since Yali in 1972 asked me his question, why Europeans and not New Guineans brought the cargo. This is the biggest question of history, why history has unfolded differently on different continents. but it's a question that historians themselves, by and large, have ignored. In the absence of a convincing answer, many or most people fall back on racist explanations. Anyone can see that different people have different hair and different skin colors and different eyes, and so it seems natural to assume that inside the heads they also have different brains, although there's no evidence, despite the efforts of generations of racist scholars, there's no evidence for genetically different IQs, intelligence, among different people. And despite what seemed to me the at least equal intelligence of New Guineans. But cargo, material possessions, technology, as well as writing and kings, didn't fall out of the blue sky. Instead, they arose in human history from a long chain of causes, of which the crucial first step was the adoption of agriculture. 11,000 years ago, people everywhere in the world were hunters and gatherers, like your Jomon people of Japan, hunting wild animals and gathering wild plants. Beginning around 11,000 years ago in some parts of the world, hunting and gathering led unconsciously to agriculture and herding. That happened because human processing of wild plants and animals domesticated the wild plants and animals, that's to say unconsciously modified them so as to control their reproduction and so as to make them more useful to us humans. But only a small fraction of wild plants and animals lend themselves to domestication. Just try domesticating a bear like your Japanese bear. It has never been done for obvious reasons. The few wild species that have been domesticated were concentrated in just 9 small areas of the world, which thereby became the first homelands of agriculture. Agriculture produced a population explosion because of all the food. Agriculture permitted food surpluses. Food surpluses made it possible to feed full-time inventors like Thomas Edison, made it possible to feed kings and emperors like your emperor. But technology and kings and writing, those are the ingredients of human power. And they developed faster among people in the parts of the world that first developed agriculture, more slowly in some parts and never in other parts of the world. In short, the people of Europe and Asia ended up with more cargo than New Guineans because of their good luck of biogeography, not because of their brains or anything else about the biology of European and Asian people themselves. My book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, won the Pulitzer Prize for general nonfiction, and I quickly followed it with my shortest book, Why is Sex Fun?, about the evolution of human sexuality. While Guns, Germs, and Steel has been my most successful book, I'm proud to say that Why is Sex Fun? Has been my least successful book, because bookstores, when they see the book's title, Why is Sex Fun?, think that it belongs in the erotica section, the sex book section of a store, where readers going into the sex book section are looking for pictures and explanation of postures, and they are not looking for a sober explanation of the evolution of human sexuality, so they don't buy my book. In 2002, I completed my career shift by closing my laboratory of experimental physiology and by moving from UCLA's medical school to its geography department. Ever since, I've been teaching geography to undergraduates who serve as guinea pigs, test students on whom to try out the ideas of each of my next books. It's better for me to get my ideas scrutinized by friendly students before I publish the book than by angry, hostile reviewers after I publish the book. Since I closed my laboratory and moved to the geography department, I've written 4 books aimed at the broad public. My next book following Guns, Germs, and Steel and Why is Sex Fun was Collapse, published in 2005, discussing why some past societies, such as the Easter Islanders, collapsed through unintentionally destroying the environmental resources on which they depended, while other societies, such as Jomon Japan, continued to thrive. My book Collapse is full of lessons for our world today, which risks collapsing on a global scale through worldwide environmental risk mismanagement. My next book, The World Until Yesterday, published in 2012, compared traditional societies, such as the New Guinea tribal societies, among whom I've spent so much of my life, comparing New Guinea societies with our modern industrial societies, Japan and the United States and Europe, with respect to how they and we address those universal human problems such as how to raise our children, how to grow old, how to remain healthy, how to confront danger. In my most recent book, Upheaval, which just appeared in Japan on October 28, compares political crises in 7 modern nations, including 2 chapters on Japan and 2 chapters on the United States, viewing those political crises from the perspective of the personal crises that all of us confront as individuals, and that are a specialty of my clinical psychologist wife, Marie, who works with her clients struggling with their own personal crises, like the breakdown of marriages and the deaths of loved ones. All of those books of mine, written for the public, use the comparative method based on natural experiments. I can manipulate gallbladders. I cannot manipulate birds, and I can certainly not manipulate people. I could learn about politics very quickly if I were permitted to kill all Americans west of the Mississippi River and enrich all Americans east of the Mississippi River. But that would be not nice, and it's not possible. Instead, I have to resort to natural experiments to understand human history, just as to understand birds. Most historians carry out single case studies of just one society. They'll publish a book on, say, Italy in the late 19th century. The single case method and my comparative method offer different advantages and different disadvantages. In the single case study, you can devote the whole book to Italy in the late 19th century. In a comparative study, comparing 7 countries, you can devote only 1 chapter to 19th century Italy. But in compensation, the comparative method poses questions and offers perspectives that you would never get from the single case study. And this advantage underlies the quip, the historian who studies just one society ends up understanding no society. To date, my books have appeared in 40 languages, including all of the major languages of book publishing, plus some smaller languages, like the Azerbaijan language and the Mongolian language and the Estonian language. Writing for the public requires that an author develop a thick skin, as Eric has also discovered, because reviewers can be vicious. In compensation, though, public writing can influence the world. Every day, I receive emails from students who've been reading my books, and at each public lecture, I'm approached by people who tell me that my books changed their lives. Those people include at least 4 married couples who told me that they established their relationship because on their first date, they discovered that both of them were reading the same book of mine, and that gave them a bond and a shared interest that went on and led to a happy marriage. I recommend that method to all of you who are not yet married. So what lies ahead of me? At age 82, I'm still returning to New Guinea to study birds. I'm still teaching University of California undergraduates. I'm still planning the next book. The world's problems are still becoming more serious, faster and faster. We humans are currently harvesting our planet's resources unsustainably at rates that cannot be continued for more than a few decades. And at the same time, our efforts to solve the world's problems are also accelerating. How is it all going to end? We don't know, because the way it ends will depend upon the choices that the world's people will make in the near future, and I can't predict what choices people will make. But all of you who, like me, have children and who have grandchildren of your own, or all of you who hope to have children, you hold a personal investment in our world's future. Those of us who are scientists and who can and want to write in a language that the public understands can play a key role in influencing the public's choices. Why should we be hopeful? I see two big reasons to be hopeful. One reason for hope is increasing public recognition of environmental problems. There's much more public recognition now of our environmental problems than there was only 5 years ago. That gives me hope. And the other big thing that gives me hope is increasing recognition of environmental problems by big businesses in the last 20 years. Big businesses like Walmart and Chevron and Unilever. 20 years ago, environmentalists like me thought of big businesses as evil, as destroying the environment, as the cause of the world's problems. But within the last 20 years, I and many other people have seen that, in fact, some big businesses are among the most potent forces for hope and for environmental improvement in the world today. That's illustrated by where we are now. We are here at a prize ceremony for a major prize, the Blue Planet Prize. And the money for these prizes and for these events, the money was not provided by a private nonprofit charity. The money was not provided by a non-governmental environmental organization like World Wildlife Fund. The money was instead provided by a for-profit international company, Asahi Glass, which already in the year 1992, long before Walmart and Chevron, realized that the environment is so crucial to human survival and to the happiness of Asahi Glass employees and to the profitability of Asahi Glass Company itself, that Asahi Glass led the way in establishing these prizes and in establishing a model of big businesses, instead of destroying the environment, taking a lead in promoting the care for the environment. Those two things, the growth of environmental awareness among the public and the growth of environmental awareness among big businesses like Asahi Glass, those are the two things that gives me most hope. Those are the things that motivate Eric and me to keep studying environmental problems and to keep writing for the public. Thank you.